I have tricks in my pocket. I have things up my sleeve, but I'm the opposite of a stage magician. He give you an illusion of appearance of truth. I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of an illusion. I take you back to that alley in St. Louis, the time-quaint period when the huge middle classes of America was matriculating from the school of the blind. Their eyes had failed them, or they had failed their eyes. And so they were having their fingers pressed forcefully down the fiery braille alphabet of the dissolving economy. In Spain, it was revolution. Here, it was only shouting and confusion, label disturbances, and sometimes violent and otherwise peaceful cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. This is the social background of this play. The play is in memory. Being a memory play, it is dimly lit. It is sentimental. It is not realistic. In memory, everything seems to happen to music, and that explains the fiddle in the wings. I am the narrator of this play and also a character in it. The other characters in this play is my mother, Amanda, my sister, Laura, and the gentleman caller who appears in the final scene. He is the most realistic of the characters in this play, being an emissary from a world that we were somehow set apart from, but having a poetic weakness for symbols. I am using this character as a symbol, as the long-delayed but always expected something we live for. There is a fifth character who doesn't appear other than a photograph hanging on the wall. When you see this picture of this grinning gentleman, please remember that this is our father who left us a long time ago. He was a telephone man who fell in love with long distances, so he gave up his job with the telephone company and skipped the light fantastic out of town. The last we heard from him was a picture postcard containing 2 words: hello, goodbye, and no address. After the fiasco at Rubican's Business College, the ideal of getting a gentleman caller for my sister Laura began to play more and more an important role in my mother's calculations. It became an obsession, like some archetype of the universal unconscious. This image of a gentleman caller haunted our small apartment, and even in that home rarely passed without some illusion of this image, this specter, this hope. And even when he wasn't mentioned, his presence hung in my mother's preoccupied look and my sister's frightened, apologetic manner. It hung like a sentence passed upon the wing fields. But my mother was a woman of action as well as words. She began to take logical steps in the planned direction. Late that winter and early spring, realizing that extra money would be needed to properly feather the nest and plume the bird, she began a vigorous campaign on the telephone, roping in subscribers to one of those magazines for matrons called The Homemaker's Companions, the type of journal that features serialized sublimations of ladies of letters who think in terms of delicate cup-like breasts, slim, tapering waist, rich, creamy thighs, eyes like wood, smoke in autumn, fingers that soothe and crest like soft strands of music, bodies as powerful as Etruscan sculpture. Across the alley was Paradise Dance Hall. Evenings in spring, they'll open up the doors and windows and the music would come outside. Sometimes they'll turn out all the lights except for the large glass spears that hung from the ceilings. It would turn slowly about and filter the dust with delicate rainbow colors. Then the orchestra would play a waltz or a tango, something that had a slow, sinuous rhythm. The young couples would come outside to the relative privacy of the alley. You can see them kissing behind aspens and telephone poles. This was the compensation for lives that passed like mines without change or adventure. Change and adventure, however, were imminent this year. They were waiting around the corners for all these dancing kids, suspended in the mist over Birch's garden, caught in the folds of Chamberlain's umbrella. In Spain, there were Guernica. Here there was only hot swing music and liquor, dance halls, bars, and movies, and sex that hung in the gloom like a chandelier and flooded the world with brief, deceptive rainbows. While these unsuspecting kids danced to Dear One, the world is waiting for the sunrise, all the world was really waiting on was bombardments. And so the following evening, I brought Jim home to dinner. I'd known Jim slightly in high school. In high school, Jim was a hero. He had tremendous good nature and vitality with the scrubbed and polished look of a white chinaware. He seemed to move in a continual spotlight. He was the star in basketball, captain of the debating club, president of the senior class and the glee club, and he sang the male lead in an annual light opera. He was forever running or bounding, never just walking. He seemed always just at the point of defeating the laws of gravity. He was shooting with such velocity that you would just logically expect him to arrive at nothing short of the White House by the time he was 30. But Jim apparently ran into more interference after his graduation from high school because his speed had definitely slowed. And so, at this particular time in our lives, he was holding a job that wasn't much better than mine. He was the only one at the warehouse with whom I was on friendly terms. I was valuable to Jim as someone who could remember his former glory, who had seen him win basketball games and the Silver Cup in debating. He knew of my secret practice of retiring to a cabinet of the washroom to work on poems whenever business was slack in the warehouse. He called me Shakespeare. And while other boys in the warehouse regarded me with such suspicious hostility, Jim took a humorous attitude towards me. Gradually, his attitude began to affect the other boys and their hostility wore off. And so after time, they began to smile at me too, as people smile at oddly fashioned dogs that trotted across their path at some distance. I knew that Jim and Laura had known each other in high school because I heard my sister Laura speak admiringly of Jim's voice. I didn't know if Jim would remember her or not, because in high school, Laura had been as unobtrusive as Jim has been astonishing. And if he did remember Laura, it was not of my sister, for when I asked him to come to dinner, he smiled and said, "You know, a funny thing, Shakespeare, I never thought of you as having folks." Well, he was about to discover I did. I didn't go to the moon. I went much farther, for time is the longest distance between two places. I left St. Louis. I descended these steps of the fire escape for the last time, and I followed from then on in my father's footsteps, attempted to find in motion what was lost in space. I traveled around a great deal. The city swept about me like dead leaves that were brightly colored but torn away from the branches. I would have stopped, but I was pursued by something. It always came upon me unawares, taking me altogether by surprise. Perhaps it was a familiar bit of music. Perhaps it was a piece of transparent glass. Perhaps I am walking along the street at night in some strange city. Before I have found companions, I passed a lighted window of a shop where perfume is sold. The window was filled with pieces of colored glass, tiny transparent bottles of delicate colors like bits of shattered rainbows. Then all at once my sister touches my shoulder. I turn around and I look into her eyes. Oh, Laura, I tried to leave you behind me, but I am more faithful than I intended to be. I reach for a cigarette. I cross the street. I run into a movie or a bar. I buy a drink. I speak to the nearest stranger. Anything that can blow your candles out. For nowadays, the world is lit by lightning. Blow out your candles, Laura. And so, goodbye.